When an avoidant begins to feel something, real something, they can't easily categorize or control the first place, you'll see it is not in what they say, but in what they stop filtering. Avoidants are highly practiced at managing perception. They've learned, often early in life, that vulnerability comes with a cost, so they develop a version of themselves that is polished, self-contained, and emotionally efficient. It's not fake in the sense of being dishonest, it's protective. It's curated, and it keeps them safe. So when that curation starts to slip, that's not weakness, that's significance. You'll notice moments where they don't have the perfect response, where they hesitate, where they contradict themselves, where they reveal something slightly messy or unresolved. Maybe they admit confusion. Maybe they share a memory they usually keep buried. Maybe they show you a side of themselves that isn't impressive, isn't controlled, isn't together. For most people, that might seem ordinary. For an avoidant, that's exposure. And here's the key distinction. They're not doing it for effect. They're not trying to bond through vulnerability as a strategy. In fact, it often looks awkward, even uncomfortable. That's how you know it's real. Because what you're witnessing is not performance, that's the absence of it. Authentic love, especially for someone with avoidant tendencies, disrupts their internal system. It challenges the belief that they must always be composed, always independent, always in control. And when that system gets challenged, something deeper begins to emerge, a more honest version of who they are beneath the defenses. Now, this doesn't happen all at once. It comes in fragments, a sentence here, a moment there. And sometimes, right after opening up, they might pull back again. That doesn't mean the moment wasn't real. It means it was too real. You have to understand the internal conflict. Part of them wants connection, but another part is wired to retreat from it. So when they let you see their unfiltered self, even briefly, they're stepping into unfamiliar territory. And that step matters more than grand declarations ever could, because anyone can say the right words. Anyone can create the illusion of closeness. But very few people, especially those who fear vulnerability, will risk being seen without control. That's the difference between attention and authenticity. One is easy. The other requires courage. When an avoidant allows you to witness their imperfections without immediately shutting you out, they are showing you that they value your presence and are willing to work through their issues with you. They are, in their own way, trusting you with something they rarely give anyone, access to their reality, not the refined version, not the safe version, the real one. And real love doesn't begin with perfection, it begins with truth. So don't measure their feelings by how smoothly they express themselves. Measure it by how willing they are to let the mask fall, even if just for a moment. Because in that moment, you're not just being liked, you're being let in. And for an avoidant, being seen without armor is not just vulnerability, it's love. If you stay with this pattern long enough, you begin to recognize that for an avoidant, distance is not just a preference, it's a reflex. When emotions intensify, when expectations rise, when connection starts to feel like it might require something deeper, their instinct is to create space. Not because they don't care, but because closeness to them has historically meant pressure, loss of control, or even pain. So they withdraw to regulate themselves. That's the baseline, which is why the real shift, the meaningful shift happens when they start doing something that goes against that wiring. They stay, not perfectly, not consistently at first, but noticeably. You'll see it in the moments where instead of disappearing for days, they respond. Maybe it's shorter than you'd like. Maybe it's delayed, but it's there. You'll see it when a conversation becomes emotionally charged, and instead of shutting down completely, it opens up a dialogue that can lead to a deeper understanding and connection. They remain engaged even if they're uncomfortable, even if they don't have the right words. That effort to stay present, especially when every instinct is telling them to pull away, is not small. It's profound. Because presence for an avoidant is a form of vulnerability. Understand this. It's easy to be present when things are light, when there's no emotional demand. But when real connection starts to form, when feelings deepen, when the relationship begins to matter, that's when their internal alarm system activates. Their mind starts scanning for ways to regain control, to reduce intensity, to create distance. And in the past, that strategy worked. It kept them safe. So when they override that impulse even slightly, something important is happening beneath the surface. They are choosing connection over protection. And that choice is not driven by logic, it's driven by feeling. Now, this doesn't mean they suddenly become highly expressive or emotionally fluent. They may still struggle to articulate what's going on inside them. They may still need space at times. But the difference is in the pattern. Instead of complete withdrawal, there is an attempt to reconnect. Instead of silence, there is some form of response. Instead of avoidance being absolute, it becomes negotiable. That's growth. And more importantly, that's investment. Because people don't fight their deepest patterns for something that doesn't matter. They don't challenge their own comfort zone for a connection they can easily replace. When an avoidance starts to remain present, even imperfectly, they're signaling that this relationship holds weight, that losing it would cost them something. You might notice that they come back quicker after pulling away, or that they initiate contact when they normally wouldn't, or that they sit through conversations they once would have avoided entirely. These are not random behaviors. These are indicators of internal conflict where one part of them still seeks distance, but another part is beginning to value closeness more. And that tension is where real change begins. It's important not to misinterpret their presence as ease. Just because they're staying doesn't mean it feels natural to them. In many cases, it's the opposite. It takes effort. It takes awareness. And sometimes it takes restraint holding themselves in the moment instead of escaping it. That's why consistency, even in small doses, matters more than intensity. Anyone can show up once. But when someone who is wired to leave starts choosing again and again to stay even in subtle ways, that's not coincidence. That's intention. So don't just look at how they show up when things are good. Pay attention to how they behave when things become real, when emotions are involved, when it would be easier for them to disappear. If they're still there, still trying, still engaging in some form, that's your answer. Because for an avoidant, staying present isn't natural behavior, it's a conscious act of courage. And when someone chooses to stay, when their instinct is to run, they're not just interested, they're invested. If you follow the pattern even deeper, you start to realize that an avoidant doesn't just guard their emotions, they guard their entire inner world, their thoughts, their past, their interpretations of what they've lived through. These are not things they offer easily. Privacy for them is not just a habit, it's a boundary that protects their sense of independence and control. So when they begin to include you in that inner world, it's not casual, it's deliberate, even if they don't fully realize they're doing it. At first, it might show up in small, almost unremarkable ways. They mention something about their childhood they've never brought up before. They share a personal opinion that feels more layered than surface-level conversation. They let you see how they think, not just what they do. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice something subtle but powerful there, no longer just interacting with you, they're revealing themselves to you. That's a different level of connection. Because for an avoidant, being known is far more exposing than being liked. Being liked can be managed. It can be maintained through behavior, humor, or distance. But being known requires transparency. It requires letting someone see the patterns, the contradictions, the unresolved parts, and that's where their resistance usually lives. So when that resistance starts to soften, something meaningful is happening. You might notice that they begin to reference their past in a more open way, not just facts, but experiences that shaped them. They might talk about moments where they felt misunderstood or situations where they learned to rely only on themselves. These aren't just stories, they are clues. They are giving you context for who they are and why they operate the way they do. And context is intimacy. They may also start sharing their internal conflicts, the things they're unsure about, the decisions they struggle with, the thoughts they don't usually say out loud. This is significant because avoidants are typically very self-contained. They process internally. They don't often invite others into that process. So when they begin to externalize it with you, they're not just communicating, they're trusting. Now, trust for an avoidant is not built through intensity. It's built through safety over time. It's built through observing that you don't misuse what they share, that you don't overwhelm them when they open up, that you don't turn their vulnerability into pressure. And once that safety is established, even partially, they start to lower the barrier. Not completely, but enough to let you in. And when that happens, you'll feel the shift. Conversations become more meaningful. There's more depth, more nuance. You're no longer just exchanging words or exchanging perspectives. You start to understand how they see the world, how they interpret relationships, how they make sense of their own emotions. That's when the connection moves from surface to substance. But here's the important part. This inclusion is not always consistent. There may be moments where they open up, followed by moments where they become more reserved again. That's not contradiction, it's calibration. They're testing the space, adjusting to a level of closeness that still feels manageable to them. And every time they choose to open that door again, even slightly, they're reinforcing something internally that letting you in is not a threat. That matters more than any grand gesture. Because when someone allows you access to their inner world, they are giving you something that cannot be manufactured or faked. They are letting you see the architecture of who they are, the beliefs, the experiences, the quiet fears, the unspoken desires. And that level of access is not given out of convenience. It's given out of value. So if you find yourself being included in those deeper layers, don't overlook it. Don't rush it. Recognize it for what it is, a sign that they are moving beyond control and into connection. Because for an avoidant, letting you into their inner world isn't just communication, it's trust in its most honest form. As you begin to understand this pattern more clearly, you also start to see that authentic love from an avoidant rarely arrives in dramatic declarations or sweeping emotional gestures. In fact, if you're waiting for something loud and unmistakable, you might miss it entirely. Because for them, love doesn't show up as intensity, it shows up as consistency. And consistency in their world is not automatic, it's intentional. An avoidant is naturally wired to operate independently, to prioritize space, to minimize emotional dependency. So when they begin to show up in small, repeated ways, it's not chance, it's a shift in priority. It means that somewhere internally, you have become part of their routine, part of their awareness, part of what they choose to maintain rather than avoid. You might notice it in how they check in with you, not in an overwhelming or constant way, but in a steady, reliable pattern. A message here, a follow-up there. They remember something you mentioned days ago and bring it up again. They show up when it matters, even if they don't make a big announcement about it. These actions are subtle, but they carry weight, because anyone can create a moment. But very few people can sustain effort over time, especially someone whose instinct is to disengage. This is where many people misinterpret avoidance. They look for emotional intensity as proof of love, when in reality, intensity is easy. It's often impulsive, reactive, and short-lived. Consistency, on the other hand, requires discipline. It requires a decision to keep showing up, even when the emotional high isn't there, even when it would be easier to retreat into solitude. And for an avoidant, that decision is significant. You'll also notice that their consistency is often practical rather than expressive. They may not always articulate how they feel, but they demonstrate it through behavior. They do what they say they'll do. They follow through. They make time, even if it's limited. And over time, those small actions begin to form a pattern that speaks louder than any single emotional moment ever could. Because patterns reveal priorities. If someone repeatedly chooses to include you in their time, their attention, their energy, that's not accidental. That's a reflection of value. And for someone who is protective of their time and emotional bandwidth, that value is not given. Now, it's important to recognize that this consistency won't look perfect. There may still be fluctuations. There may be moments where they pull back slightly or become less responsive. But the key is not perfection, it's return. Do they come back to the pattern? Do they re-engage? Do they continue to show up in ways that over time create a sense of reliability? That's the distinction. Because consistency is not about never faltering. It's about maintaining a baseline of presence that you can recognize, even through variation. And when an avoidant establishes that baseline with you, they are, in their own way, committing to the connection. Not through words, but through repetition. And repetition builds trust. It tells you that this isn't just a moment of interest or a temporary emotional spike. It's something more grounded, more stable, more real. It's the difference between someone who feels something briefly and someone who is willing to carry that feeling forward into action. So instead of asking, did they express love perfectly? Ask a more meaningful question. Do they keep showing up in the ways they're capable of over time? Because when someone who is naturally inclined to distance begins to choose steady presence again and again, they are telling you something far more valuable than words ever could. They are showing you that you matter enough to be part of their consistency. And in a world full of temporary emotions, consistent effort is the clearest expression of something real. As this connection deepens, there's another shift that becomes impossible to ignore, not in what they feel, but in what they're willing to confront within themselves. Because at a certain point, authentic love doesn't just invite closeness, it demands growth. And for an avoidant, growth is not an abstract idea. It's a direct challenge to the very patterns that have kept them safe for years. Avoidants don't resist change because they're incapable of it. They resist it because it disrupts their sense of control. Their independence, their emotional distance, their ability to self-regulate without relying on anyone else. These are not accidental traits. They are learned strategies. And those strategies have worked. They've prevented overwhelm, protected them from vulnerability, and allowed them to function without depending too heavily on others. So when love enters the equation, it doesn't just feel good, it creates friction. Because real connection requires something they're not used to offering consistently: emotional availability, communication, presence during discomfort. And these are not small adjustments. These are structural changes to how they relate to people and to themselves. That's why growth in this context becomes one of the clearest indicators of authentic feeling. You'll begin to notice that they're trying, sometimes quietly, sometimes imperfectly, to do things differently. Maybe they make an effort to communicate instead of shutting down completely. Maybe they stay in conversations that would normally overwhelm them. Maybe they acknowledge something about themselves that they've avoided for years. These moments may not look dramatic from the outside, but internally they represent a significant shift, because they are choosing discomfort over pe, er, eve, yera, che, nos, te, yeri. And that choice is not easy. Growth requires awareness, first the recognition that their usual patterns may no longer serve the relationship. Then it requires effort, the willingness to act differently, even when it feels unnatural. And finally, it requires consistency, the decision to keep trying, even when progress is slow or uneven. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that entire process can feel destabilizing. It means stepping out of a familiar identity and into something less certain. It means risking emotional exposure. It means acknowledging that independence alone is no longer enough. And people don't do that for something they can easily walk away from. If they're attempting to grow, if they're making space for difficult conversations, if they're reflecting on their own behavior, if they're adjusting how they respond to you, that's not random effort. That's investment. That's them recognizing that this connection has value beyond comfort. Now, it's important to keep this grounded in reality. Growth doesn't mean transformation overnight. It doesn't mean they suddenly become emotionally fluent or consistently available in every moment. There will still be hesitation. There will still be setbacks. But what matters is the direction, not the speed. Are they moving toward connection, even if slowly? Are they becoming more aware, more responsive, more willing to engage than they were before? That's the measure. Because real growth is not about perfection, it's about intention sustained over time. And when that intention is present, even in small ways, it tells you that they are not just feeling something, they are acting on it. And action is where feelings become real. You may notice that they begin to challenge their own routines. Where they once would have withdrawn, they pause. Where they once would have avoided a conversation, they attempt it. Where they once would have dismissed something uncomfortable, they sit with it a little longer. These are not coincidences. These are decisions, and decisions reflect priorities. So if someone who has spent years protecting themselves begins to take steps, however small, toward being more open, more present, more engaged, it means that something has shifted internally. It means that the connection is no longer something they're just experiencing. It's something they're choosing to invest in. Because growth is never random. It is always the result of something that matters enough to challenge who you've been. And when someone is willing to evolve, not because they have to, but because they don't want to lose what they feel, that's when you know the connection has moved beyond comfort and into something far more powerful. Because real love doesn't just feel good, it compels you to become better. If you follow this progression all the way through, you arrive at a point that many people misunderstand about avoidance, the idea that they don't feel deeply or that they can walk away without impact. On the surface, it can look that way. They can appear composed, detached, even indifferent when things become uncertain. But that perception misses something fundamental. Avoidants don't lack feeling, they manage it differently. And when the feeling becomes real, when it crosses from interest into genuine emotional attachment, something shifts internally that they can't easily ignore. They begin to recognize the possibility of loss. Now, for most people, the fear of losing someone they care about is obvious. It shows up openly, sometimes even dramatically. But for an avoidant, that fear is far more subtle. It doesn't always come out in direct statements or emotional confessions. Instead, it reveals itself in behavior, in small but meaningful changes that signal increased awareness of your presence and your potential absence. You might notice that they become more attentive than they used to be. They respond a little quicker. They check in without a clear reason. They show a heightened sensitivity to shifts in your tone or your availability. These are not random reactions. These are signs that internally something has changed or the role in their life is no longer neutral. Because once someone matters, the idea of losing them introduces risk. And risk is exactly what avoidants have spent most of their lives trying to minimize. So when that risk becomes real, when they realize that your presence is not guaranteed, that the connection could change or even end it, creates a kind of internal tension. Part of them wants to maintain control, to stay emotionally regulated, to avoid dependency. But another part begins to recognize that detachment now comes with a cost. That cost is you. And when that realization takes hold, even quietly, their behavior begins to reflect it. They may not say, "I'm afraid of losing you." In fact, they often won't. But you'll see it in how they start to protect the connection in their own way. They might make more of an effort to maintain communication. They might become more present during interactions. They might even show moments of uncharacteristic vulnerability, not because they've suddenly changed their nature, but because the stakes feel different. This is where many people misinterpret avoidance again. They expect fear of loss to look like emotional intensity or verbal reassurance. But for an avoidant, it often looks like increased effort, subtle shifts in attention, and a quiet attempt to hold on to something without fully knowing how to express it. And that's important to understand. Because fear in this context is not weakness, it's awareness. It's the recognition that this connection is no longer interchangeable, that it holds a unique place in their life. And once that awareness exists, it becomes very difficult for them to go back to complete detachment. You may also notice that they become more affected by distance than before. Where they once seemed unaffected by time apart or reduced communication, now there's a change. There's a sense of noticing, of reacting internally, even if they don't fully articulate it. That shift is subtle, but it's significant. It means the connection has moved beyond convenience and into meaning. Now, this doesn't mean they will always handle that fear perfectly. Sometimes, ironically, the fear of losing you can trigger the very behaviors that risk creating distance. They may become conflicted, unsure how to balance their need for space with their growing attachment. But even within that conflict, there is truth, because you don't struggle with losing something that doesn't matter. So if you begin to see signs that they are more aware of you, then you can start to feel a sense of comfort and security. More responsive to your presence, more affected by the idea of distance or change, understand what's happening beneath the surface. This is not random behavior. This is emotional significance making itself known in a way they can't fully suppress. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional control, that is no small thing. Because the moment an avoidant begins to feel the weight of potentially losing you is the moment they can no longer pretend that you're just another connection. You become someone they don't want to lose. And when someone who is wired to detach starts to fear your absence, they will begin to feel a sense of loss and longing for you. It means you are no longer outside their wazoo or part of what they are trying to protect. When you step back and look at all of this together, a pattern begins to emerge, one that is easy to miss if you're only looking for obvious expressions of love. Because with an avoidant, authentic love doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself in perfect words or grand emotional displays. It reveals itself in shifts, subtle, consistent, and often uncomfortable shifts that go against their very nature. It's in the moment they stop filtering who they are and allow you to see what's real. It's in the effort to stay present when every instinct tells them to pull away. It's in the quiet decision to let you into their inner world, piece by piece, without knowing exactly how it will be received. It's in the consistency of small actions that, over time, build something far more powerful than intensity ever could. It's in their willingness to grow, not because it's easy, but because the connection matters enough to challenge who they've always been. And ultimately, it's in that unspoken awareness that losing you would not be simple, that your presence has weight. This is what authentic love looks like through the lens of someone who fears vulnerability. It's not perfect. It's not always smooth. And it doesn't follow the patterns most people expect. But it is real. In many ways, it's more real because every step toward connection requires them to confront something within themselves that they would normally avoid. And that's the distinction you have to understand. Anyone can give you words. Anyone can create moments. But when someone is wired to protect themselves at all costs begins to choose again and again to move closer instead of a way that's not SLUCHI kratkoi, that's not convenience. That's not habit. That's intention. So if you're trying to